He broke her arm in the street, thinking she was just a child. But when he found out whose granddaughter she was, it was too late. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you watch this video from. The late afternoon sun hung lazily over the town of Red River, Texas, casting long golden shadows across the cracked sidewalks and sun-bleached storefronts. The air shimmered above the asphalt, thick with the scent of dust, creosote, and barbecue drifting from somewhere down the block. Crickets chirped in the underbrush near the edges of old fences, and the occasional pickup truck rumbled slowly past, tires crunching gravel, its driver offering a silent nod to anyone they passed. Time here moved slower than elsewhere, and most folks preferred it that way. Macy Norris leaned her forehead against the window of her grandfather's truck, watching the landscape roll by like a painted memory. Her dark blonde curls were pinned back in a simple braid, and her green eyes scanned the scenery with a quiet alertness that far exceeded her 11 years. She wasn't like most girls her age, not because of anything she did or said, but because of how she saw the world. Where others might overlook, Macy noticed. Where others avoided, Macy asked. She had the steady patience of someone who'd been taught not to rush, and the calm resilience of someone who'd already seen more than her age should allow. It was her second week in Red River. Her parents, both international aid workers, had flown overseas for a 6-week deployment and had left Macy in what they called the safest hands imaginable, those of her grandfather, Charles "Chuck" Norris. To most of the world, he was a legend, movie star, martial artist, former military man, and symbol of grit. But to Macy, he was simply Grandpa Chuck. He made her scrambled eggs every morning. He still called her kiddo with a grin, and he treated her like she mattered, not just as a child, but as a person. His home sat just outside the town, nestled behind a thicket of oak trees and iron fencing, with a wide front porch and rocking chairs that creaked in the wind. There was no grand gate or mansion, just a modest one-story ranch house with a dojo behind it, where he taught neighborhood kids and veterans 3 days a week. Macy loved to sit on the edge of the mat and watch him move, not fast, not flashy, but with a control and precision that made the air itself seem to bend around him. That morning had been like most others. They'd had breakfast on the porch, scrambled eggs and toast, and Chuck had let Macy walk into town alone for the first time, a small rite of passage. The library was only 6 blocks down, and Macy had practically memorized the streets by now. She wore her favorite canvas backpack, carried a water bottle and a notebook, and promised to text when she arrived. By the time she reached the library, the heat had settled in for the day. Inside, the building was cool and quiet, filled with the scent of old books and floor polish. Macy spent nearly 2 hours browsing the shelves and sketching in her notebook. She loved to draw, faces mostly. She tried to capture expressions, moments of emotion that flickered across people like sunlight through leaves. She didn't just draw people smiling. She drew people thinking, hoping, regretting. Her latest sketch had been a rough portrait of an elderly woman she'd seen sitting at the town square days earlier, her eyes distant, fingers curled around a rosary. At around 4 p.m., Macy thanked the librarian, tucked her sketchbook under her arm, and stepped back into the burning air. The sidewalk radiated warmth through the soles of her sneakers, and a dog barked lazily behind a chain-link fence across the street. She munched on a red apple she'd picked up from the library's fruit basket for kids and walked toward home at an unhurried pace, her backpack slung over one shoulder. As she passed the edge of Westmore Park, her steps slowed. Across the field, near the basketball court, 2 figures caught her attention, a tall white police officer and a teenage black boy, maybe 15 or 16. The boy was on the ground, hands behind his head, and the officer loomed over him, shouting something Macy couldn't hear. There were no other people nearby. The park, at that time of day, was usually deserted except for the occasional jogger. Something felt wrong. Macy didn't run, didn't panic. Instead, she stepped quietly off the sidewalk, walking closer while keeping to the shade of a tall oak. She crouched beside a bench, pulled out her phone, and began recording. Through the lens, she could see the officer gripping the boy's arm, yanking him up roughly, his voice sharp and commanding. The boy winced, cried out, then stumbled as he was shoved against the hood of a patrol car parked at the curb. Macy felt her heart beat faster, her stomach tighten. She didn't know the law, but she knew what fear looked like, and the boy was terrified. She kept recording. She knew Grandpa Chuck would want her to. He always said, "If you see something wrong, don't just look away." Then the officer turned, his eyes locked onto her. Macy's fingers instinctively curled around the phone tighter, and she stood up, trying to look calm. The officer started walking toward her, his expression hard and unreadable. His strides were wide, deliberate. Macy glanced down at her phone, thumb hovering near the emergency contact button. She'd only used it once before, by accident, and Grandpa Chuck had appeared at the library door 10 minutes later, out of breath and ready for anything. The officer stopped a few feet in front of her. He wore dark sunglasses and a stern expression. His badge read, Sergeant J. Grayson. "You recording me, little girl?" he asked. Macy hesitated. "I saw what happened. I thought I should." "You thought wrong," he said, stepping closer. "This is police business. You're interfering." "I wasn't trying to interfere," she said, her voice steady but soft. "I just didn't think he should be treated that way." Grayson reached out suddenly and snatched the phone from her hand. The screen flickered as he stopped the recording. "You got ID?" he snapped. "I'm 11, Macy replied. "I don't carry ID." "What's your name?" "Macy. Macy Norris." Grayson squinted. "Norris?" "Yes, my grandpa's Chuck Norris." That made him pause, but only for a second. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Right," he said mockingly, "and I'm the Tooth Fairy." Before Macy could respond, he reached down and grabbed her wrist, hard. She gasped, trying to pull away, but his grip tightened. "I didn't do anything wrong," she cried, panic rising now. "You're interfering in an investigation." Her body twisted as she tried to escape, and then came the crack. A sickening, unnatural sound, followed by a scream that tore from her lungs without restraint. The pain was immediate, blinding. Her sketchbook fell to the ground, pages fluttering. The apple rolled into the gutter, forgotten. She crumpled to her knees, clutching her wrist. Tears blurred her vision, but even through the haze of agony, her thumb found the emergency button on her smartwatch. She pressed it. And somewhere, miles away, Chuck Norris's phone buzzed. He had been sorting a stack of letters in his workshop when he saw Macy's name flash across the screen, accompanied by the word SOS. He didn't hesitate. He didn't ask questions. He didn't call anyone. He simply moved. 30 seconds later, Chuck Norris was already out the door, keys in hand, his mind razor-sharp and focused. In his other hand, he gripped a small, battered first aid kit and a USB drive labeled Praetorian, a quiet nod to a network of former military contacts he hadn't called upon in years. The girl he had raised to think, observe, and never shrink from doing what was right had called him. And no force on earth was going to stop him now. The emergency room at Red River General Hospital buzzed with its usual Sunday lethargy, a mixture of soft intercom tones, the shuffle of tired feet, and the muted murmur of daytime television from a mounted screen in the waiting area. But when the sliding doors whooshed open and the paramedics wheeled in a trembling young girl with tears streaking her cheeks and her left arm cradled awkwardly against her chest, that quiet broke. Nurses scrambled, alert now. The trauma signs weren't catastrophic, but there was something jarring in the girl's face, a combination of raw pain and confused dignity that made several staff members pause in the middle of their motions. "She's got a distal radius fracture," one of the EMTs called as the gurney was pulled into exam bay 4. "No guardian on site. We picked her up from the sidewalk. No uniformed officer stayed on scene." "No parent? No report?" asked the charge nurse, already snapping on gloves. She looked over at Macy, who bit her lip hard to keep from whimpering as a nurse gently unzipped her jacket. "Sweetie, can you tell us your name?" "Macy," she whispered. "Macy Norris." The nurse blinked. The name sounded familiar, but she didn't dwell on it. "We're going to take care of you, okay? Can you tell us what happened?" Macy shook her head. Not because she didn't know. She knew all too well, but because her throat was closing from the fear and the pain and the strange sense of betrayal that weighed heavier than her injury. A doctor arrived, quickly confirmed the fracture, and ordered an X-ray. As they wheeled her down the hall, Macy clutched her right hand tightly around the one thing she hadn't let go of, the smartwatch on her wrist. The screen glowed faintly. The emergency call was still active. She didn't know if he'd heard her scream, if he'd heard the crunch of her bone, if he'd heard her crying afterward. But she knew he'd seen the alert. She knew he'd come. 15 minutes later, as they set her arm in a temporary splint and administered a light dose of pain medication, the ER doors swung open again. No alarm, no noise, just presence. Chuck Norris walked in with a step that was neither hurried nor relaxed. It was precise, measured. The security guard by the entrance straightened instinctively. He didn't ask for ID. He didn't need to. The man exuded the kind of quiet authority that made people move aside not out of fear, but because they recognized something in him they couldn't name. Something old and exact and dangerous when provoked. He didn't speak to anyone as he passed the front desk. His eyes were scanning, locked, purposeful. "Patient, Macy Norris," he said when he reached the triage station, voice calm but carrying weight. The nurse, startled, glanced at her clipboard, then up at him. "She's in Bay 4, just out of X-ray." He nodded once and moved without hesitation. When he reached the exam room, the curtain was half drawn. Inside, Macy sat propped on a pillow, her small frame dwarfed by the hospital bed. She turned at the sound of his footsteps and exhaled sharply, tears welling again, not from the pain, but from the relief of seeing him. He crossed to her in 2 strides, knelt beside her bed, and gently took her right hand. She squeezed his fingers as tightly as she could. "He broke it," she whispered. "I know," he said, his voice soft, low, and steady as a stone. "I told him my name. I told him who you are." He laughed. His jaw clenched slightly, the only visible sign of tension, but his gaze remained on hers, unwavering. "You did exactly right, Macy. I pressed the watch, just like you said. And I got it. You're safe now." A nurse stepped in, preparing the final cast. She paused awkwardly at the sight of Chuck beside the bed. "We'll need to move her to a different bay once the cast sets," she said. "Do you have authorization?" "I'm her guardian, while her parents are abroad," Chuck replied, producing a notarized form. "Everything's in order." The nurse nodded, professionally polite but slightly unnerved. She returned to her work. As the cast was molded, Macy drifted into a pain-medicated haze. Chuck watched every movement, noting how carefully the staff treated her. Kind, attentive. Not like the man in the uniform who had grabbed her and treated her like a threat. When the procedure was finished and Macy had been moved to a private recovery room, Chuck stepped into the hallway and pulled out his phone. His face was expressionless as he opened the folder Macy had programmed into the smartwatch's emergency function. Her call had triggered an automatic recording from the watch's mic, storing the last 60 seconds of audio. He plugged in the earbuds, pressed play. First came Macy's voice, nervous, steady, answering questions. Then Grayson's, a demand, a threat, a grab. And then the snap, followed by a scream. Chuck listened without blinking. When the audio ended, he didn't speak. He copied the file to his flash drive, encrypted it, and placed the drive into a compartment inside his belt. Then he called one number. Maria Cortez answered after 2 rings. "Chuck," she said, a mixture of surprise and respect in her voice. "It's been a long time. I need everything you have on Sergeant Jeremiah Grayson," Chuck said flatly. "Red River PD." Cortez, now working internal affairs for the Texas State Police, didn't ask why. That name's come up before. Use of force complaints. Minor infractions swept under the rug. I want the files, all of them. Understood. Expect an encrypted packet within the hour. Chuck, did something happen? He looked back at the hospital room, at the child resting within it. "Yes," he said. "Something happened." By the time the sun began to set over Red River, the town remained blissfully unaware of the storm that was brewing. Grayson, meanwhile, sat at a bar stool in the corner of a smoke-filled diner 2 blocks from the station, eating a cheeseburger and laughing with a pair of off-duty officers. His phone buzzed once. He glanced at it, but didn't recognize the number. He declined the call. He had no idea that somewhere, in a darkened room lit only by the glow of a laptop screen, a folder marked Witnesses was being populated. Chuck's contacts, retired military investigators, cybersecurity analysts, legal experts, were already building a timeline. The video footage from the park was retrieved from a city-owned maintenance cam, obscured but enough to see Grayson's aggression. A witness, a teenage girl who had been walking her dog, came forward anonymously, saying she had heard a girl scream and seen a man in uniform leave without helping. Chuck didn't rush. He moved like water, adapting, surrounding, flowing through every crack in the wall that Grayson and others had built to protect themselves. This wasn't just about justice. It was about the principle of power and the people who abused it when they thought no one was watching. But someone had been watching. A little girl with a sketchbook and a sense of right and wrong. And now the man who taught her to never look away was watching too. By midnight, Chuck sat alone in his office at the back of the dojo. He had spread the documentation across the desk. Maria's packet, the audio file, the medical reports, the footage. A simple question burned in his mind. Not whether justice would be served, but how. Because some men were too protected for courts to touch. Some departments too invested in shielding their own. Some uniforms too well polished to show the dirt underneath. He reached into the drawer and pulled out an old coin, a military challenge coin given to him by a former comrade, long since gone. He turned it over in his fingers, stared at the engraved phrase, "Honor is not passive." He put the coin down and picked up his phone again. The time for asking was done. It was time to teach. The dojo was silent except for the low hum of an old ceiling fan spinning lazily overhead. Outside, the Texas night had settled deep and thick over Red River, the kind of silence that feels earned after a day scorched by heat and tension. But inside, Chuck Norris sat at his desk with the rigidity of a man who'd turned discipline into instinct. His back was straight, his shoulders relaxed but alert, and his eyes scanned the documents in front of him with the cool detachment of someone trained to absorb details quickly and completely. The lamplight on his desk cast sharp shadows across his face, highlighting the set of his jaw, the faint furrow between his brows, the eyes that had stared down enemies in war zones and liars in suits alike. In front of him lay a full report from Maria Cortez. Internal complaints, unfiled grievances, whisper statements from past colleagues who never spoke aloud, but wrote enough between the lines. Sergeant Jeremiah Grayson had 3 official reprimands in his personnel file, all of which had been retracted under review. 2 incidents involved excessive force during routine stops. 1, a wrongful detainment of a Hispanic teenager whose charges had been dropped the same day. What Maria had added, what was not in any public document, was damning. A whistleblower had reported Grayson for falsifying reports, using threats to silence civilians, and manipulating evidence in minor arrests to inflate his clearance stats. The report never made it past the precinct commander's desk. Internal Affairs had received it, but it had been buried. Chuck read everything. Twice. He opened a second folder, Macy's medical documents. Clean fracture, comminuted, not displaced. The orthopedist noted the force required to cause that level of damage in an 11-year-old was more than accidental. The notes used careful legal language, avoiding direct accusations, but Chuck didn't need implication. He had audio. He had his granddaughter's voice. He had the crack of bone, the yelp of pain, the choking sob that followed. He looked away from the screen for a moment and focused on the sketch Macy had left on the corner of his desk. It was an unfinished drawing, one of her comic panels. A little girl with a cape stood in front of a massive shadow figure, arms spread wide like a shield. Behind her, other children huddled, unsure. The girl had a name scribbled beneath her feet: Justice. He picked up the drawing carefully, folded it, and placed it into the small leather-bound notebook he used for field notes. Then he rose from the chair. He didn't call the mayor. He didn't reach out to the chief of police. He wasn't interested in meetings or measured responses. Chuck Norris understood that change didn't start with bureaucracy. It started with pressure, applied cleanly, strategically, and without compromise. The following morning began with clouds stretching across the sky like drawn-out breath, heavy with the promise of summer storms. At precisely 8:07 a.m., Chuck pulled into the gravel parking lot of the Red River Police Department. He stepped out of his truck with slow precision, dressed not for confrontation but for clarity. His boots were polished, jeans dark, and his collared shirt tucked tight beneath a brown utility jacket that bore a faded military insignia on the shoulder. He carried nothing in his hands but a thin, zippered portfolio. Inside the station, a young desk officer looked up from her computer with mild curiosity. She was new. She didn't recognize him. "Sir, can I help you?" Chuck's voice was calm. "I'm here to speak with Sergeant Grayson. I believe he's on shift." The officer typed briefly. "He's not in the office yet. I can leave a message." "No need." Chuck glanced at the roster on the wall. Grayson's name was circled on the day's schedule. "I'll wait." He didn't sit. He stood near the window and stared out at the street, arms folded, patient. 23 minutes later, Grayson strolled in with a coffee in one hand and sunglasses perched high on his forehead. He was chatting with another officer about a high school football game when he spotted Chuck. His stride slowed. Chuck turned from the window. Their eyes met. Grayson smirked, just slightly, then resumed walking. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked, voice oily with condescension. "You already have," Chuck said. Grayson looked him up and down. "You're the grandfather." Chuck nodded once. "I see." The smirk returned. "Your little princess got a bit too close to business that wasn't hers. Unfortunate, but she'll heal." Chuck didn't blink. "You broke her wrist." Grayson shrugged. "She resisted." "She's 11. Grayson's eyes narrowed. "She interfered with an investigation." "No," Chuck replied, stepping closer. "She did what any decent citizen would do when they see someone being hurt without cause. She did the right thing, and you punished her for it." A few officers had begun to take notice. The room was still. Grayson sensed the shift in tone and tried to recover the upper hand. "If you have a problem," he said tightly, "you can file a complaint like everyone else. Otherwise, I suggest you leave." "I'm not here to complain," Chuck said. "I'm here to deliver something." He handed Grayson the portfolio. Inside was a printed transcript of the audio recording, a list of witness contacts and copies of the medical report and photographs of Macy's injury. Grayson flipped through the pages with growing tension. "You don't scare me," he muttered. "I'm not here to scare you," Chuck said. "I'm here to remind you what happens when the people you hurt don't stay silent." He turned and walked toward the door. Grayson followed him outside, calling after him, "You think you can walk in here and throw weight around just because you're some washed-up martial artist?" Chuck stopped. He turned slowly, the breeze tugging lightly at his jacket. The sun had finally broken through the clouds, casting long, bright shadows across the lot. "Why don't we find out?" Chuck said, voice low. Grayson's eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" Chuck stepped into the alley that ran behind the station. It was narrow and secluded, mostly used for trash pickups and smoking breaks. Grayson followed, stopping 10 feet away. "You want to do this here?" Chuck said nothing. He waited. Grayson threw the first punch. It was fast, fueled by adrenaline and ego. Chuck didn't even move for the first half second. Then he pivoted, deflecting the swing with his forearm and using Grayson's momentum to send him stumbling forward. The officer growled and turned, swinging again more wildly. Chuck ducked, sidestepped, and with one precise motion caught Grayson's wrist mid-strike and twisted, forcing him to his knees. Grayson howled in pain. "This is what restraint looks like," Chuck said. "You break bones because you think it makes you strong. I use force to stop people like you." He released him, letting Grayson fall to the pavement. Gasping, the sergeant scrambled to his feet, his face red with fury and humiliation. Chuck stepped closer, speaking softly now. "You used your badge like a weapon, but a badge doesn't make a man worthy. A badge doesn't make you untouchable." Grayson was shaking, fist clenched, but he didn't move again. "I'll see you in court," Chuck said, "but now you've been seen." He walked away, leaving Grayson in the dust of his own rage. By noon, the video had surfaced online. Someone from inside the station, no one ever admitted who, had filmed part of the confrontation. Not the whole fight, just enough. Grayson swinging, Chuck countering, the takedown, the control. No brutality, no excess, just clarity. The video spread like wildfire. The caption read, "Chuck Norris still doesn't start fights, but he finishes them." In Red River, silence settled over the police department. And at the hospital, where Macy had just finished drawing a picture of a bird with a cast on its wing, the nurse leaned in and whispered, "You might want to check the news." Macy did. She smiled just a little. The legend was awake, and justice was moving. The morning after the video surfaced, Red River woke up different. The streets looked the same, the skies wore their familiar burnt blue, and the coffee brewed in local diners smelled no stronger than usual. But there was an electric hush in the air, as if everyone was waiting for the next beat in a rhythm they hadn't realized they were dancing to. Chuck Norris had stepped out of the shadows not just as a grandfather, but as a symbol. A line had been drawn, not with shouting or protests, not even with threats, but with a silent, deliberate act of clarity. It wasn't violence. It was truth made visible. Macy sat propped up on her hospital bed with her cast-covered arm resting in her lap. The splint was white, still clean and smooth, but she had already begun to decorate it with a few doodles, small stars, a fist in the air, and on the inside curve near her wrist, she had written one word in block letters, "Enough." She was tired. Her body hurt, her heart too. But she wasn't scared anymore. Something had shifted. The pain had burned a hole through something soft inside her, and what remained felt harder, steadier. The nurse brought her breakfast and a newspaper. The front page featured a grainy still from the video. Chuck standing tall as Sergeant Grayson reeled backward, his arm twisted behind him, his face caught in a mask of shock and pain. The headline didn't say much, but it didn't need to. Confrontation at Red River PD. Chuck Norris responds to officer who injured granddaughter. Macy stared at it in silence. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She folded the newspaper carefully and placed it beside her water cup, then picked up her pencil and began to draw. A crowd of children with their arms linked. A broken police badge on the ground. A girl with her head held high. By noon, the hospital had taken on the atmosphere of a quiet fortress. There were visitors trickling in, journalists lingering across the street, and hospital administrators whispering about PR policies. Macy remained mostly untouched by it all. Chuck had given orders. No unauthorized visitors, no statements. The door to her room remained closed unless a nurse knocked. And if anyone dared ignore that rule, they were met with Chuck himself, seated by the window like a guardian carved from patience and steel. He didn't say much. He let Macy rest, let her be a child where she still could, but his phone never left his hand. The calls had begun that morning, reporters, veterans, activists, and people he hadn't heard from in decades. Some offered help, others warned him to tread carefully, and a few, the ones he trusted most, called only to say, "Whatever you need." Maria Cortez had called twice already. The second time she confirmed what Chuck already knew. The department had no intention of disciplining Grayson. Officially, the internal investigation had been opened, but unofficially, the walls were already closing in. The captain had gone quiet. The Union was preparing a defense, and someone had started leaking stories about Chuck's aggression, framing him as unstable, threatening. "They're trying to turn this," Maria had said. "Make it about you, about your past. Make it look like your granddaughter provoked it. They're laying the groundwork." Chuck had nodded. "Let them." Maria paused. "What's your move?" "I'm not going to argue," he'd said. "I'm going to show them what real strength looks like." He meant every word. That evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Chuck sat alone in his dojo behind the house. He had turned off the lights. The room was lit only by the deep golden spill of the setting sun and the shadows of the hanging punching bags. The mats were empty. The air was thick with stillness. He moved slowly through a kata, not rushing, not thinking, just letting his body move the way it had for decades. Each motion was deliberate, silent, the language of someone who no longer needed to fight for power, but could wield it as a form of prayer. When he reached the final stance, his breath deepened and settled. He stood in the center of the mat, arms at his sides, eyes closed. Then he heard the gravel crunching outside. He walked out into the yard and found a man standing at the fence. He was older, tall, wearing a flannel shirt and a badge on his belt that wasn't quite visible. "Can I help you?" Chuck asked, voice even. "I'm Captain Leland," the man said, "Red River PD." Chuck didn't answer. He waited. "I wanted to talk. Not official business, just man to man." "Then you should have come without the badge." Leland hesitated, then stepped closer. "Off the record, what you did, that video, it's put us in a real bad spot." "No," Chuck said. "What your officer did put you in that spot. My granddaughter's arm is broken. You call that a misunderstanding?" "I call it a mistake," Leland said, "but we're under pressure here. Political, legal. We can't just—" "You mean you won't?" Chuck interrupted. "You won't hold your own accountable because it's easier to let it slide, like the last 3 complaints against him. You buried them. I have the records." Leland's face tightened. "What do you want, Mr. Norris?" "I want him off the force, not suspended, not on desk duty, gone. And I want your department to acknowledge it, publicly, truthfully. And if we don't?" Chuck took a step forward, close enough now that Leland could see every line on his face. "Then I make sure the world sees everything, every file, every report, every victim." Leland stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "You'll get your answer by the end of the week." As the captain walked away, Chuck turned and glanced at the open door of the dojo. Macy was there, watching. She hadn't made a sound. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. He looked scared. Chuck didn't smile, but his eyes softened. "He should be." The next morning, the press conference was announced. Red River PD would make a statement regarding recent events. The town buzzed with anticipation. Some hoped for accountability, others expected excuses. But Chuck didn't care about either. He wasn't attending to be satisfied. He was attending so they'd know he was still watching. When the time came, he walked to City Hall with Macy beside him, her cast newly painted with symbols of strength. An eagle, a balance scale, a pair of hands linked together. She wore a simple denim jacket over a blue t-shirt, her chin held high. They stood in the back as Captain Leland stepped up to the podium. Cameras clicked, reporters scribbled. Then the captain began to speak. He acknowledged the incident. He named Grayson. He admitted the department had failed to act swiftly in previous complaints. He announced that Grayson had been placed on indefinite leave pending the outcome of an external review. Not a firing. Not yet. But it was more than most had expected. Chuck didn't clap. Macy didn't smile. They listened. And when it was over, they walked away through the crowd, silent and firm. That night, back at home, Macy sat by the fire pit with her grandfather. The stars were faint above the Texas sky, but the moon was bright. "I don't feel small anymore," she said. "You never were," Chuck replied. She leaned her head against his arm. "They're not done trying to protect him," she said. "No," he agreed, "but neither are we." The legend had cast its shadow, but now the girl within it had found her light. The days that followed the press conference settled over Red River with the weight of something unfinished. No protests shook the streets. No sirens wailed. But the air felt different, as though the quiet itself had changed shape. The town had always known how to mind its own business, how to turn down the volume when trouble knocked too close. But not this time. Not with Chuck Norris walking openly through the town square. Not with the story of a girl with a broken wrist and a name no longer just whispered behind closed doors. At Red River Elementary, the teachers spoke in low voices about Macy. Her classmates, wide-eyed and reverent, passed rumors like gospel that she had taken on a cop, that her grandfather had flipped the man over with one hand, that the president might call. None of it was true, and all of it was true in the way children told stories. But Macy didn't indulge them. She didn't bask in the attention. She didn't boast. Instead, she sat quietly with her sketchbook in her lap, her pencil moving across the pages like her thoughts needed somewhere to live. Her cast was nearly full now. She turned it into something between a message board and a mural. There were no flowers or hearts or funny signatures. Instead, there were images of eyes, fists, open hands, and bold words like voice and truth scrawled along the edges. Near her elbow, she had written one phrase in cursive, and though it was small, anyone who saw it felt its weight. I saw, I spoke, I stayed. Chuck watched all of it with a calm detachment. He didn't guide her hand or ask her to speak. He simply made space. He continued to meet with Maria Cortez, to exchange encrypted messages with legal allies, and to forward witness reports to journalists who still cared about facts. But now he let Macy decide the rhythm of the next beat. It was Macy who asked to write a public letter. It was short, handwritten in tight lines and scanned into an email that Chuck helped her send. She didn't name names. She didn't accuse. She simply told the story, in her own words. What she saw, what she felt, what happened. She wrote not to blame, but to remind the world that children saw everything. That silence was not safety. That sometimes the smallest voices had the sharpest edges. Chuck sent the letter to one reporter, a woman he trusted, a woman who had once written about military corruption when no one else dared. She published it in full, and within hours the letter had gone viral. People from across the country began to share it. They wrote comments like, "This sounds like my daughter," or "My son went through the same," or "Thank you for saying what we couldn't." Activists reposted it, teachers printed it, parents cried over it. The media picked up the story again, but this time the tone had shifted. No longer was it just a celebrity grandfather story. Now it was about Macy, her voice, her words, her choice to speak. A week after the letter was published, Chuck received a message from a civil rights lawyer based in Dallas. He had been following the story quietly and wanted to help. He proposed forming a task force, volunteer-based, focused on documenting cases of police misconduct involving minors. Chuck agreed with one condition. Macy had to be the face of it if she wanted to be. When he asked her, she didn't answer immediately. She stood up, walked to the window, and stared out at the trees behind the house. Her casted arm hung at her side like a badge made of silence and bone. "Do you think people will listen?" she asked finally. "They're already listening," Chuck said. "Now they need something to follow." She turned to him and nodded. "Okay, let's give them something." They called it Project Lantern. The name came from a note in Macy's sketchbook, a small drawing of a child holding a lantern in the dark, lighting a path for others to follow. It wasn't political, it wasn't even confrontational. It was about exposure, about making the unseen visible, and about doing it with honesty. Project Lantern opened with an online portal and a single mission. If you're a child, or if you were hurt as a child, tell your story. You don't need to name names, just speak. The responses were overwhelming. Within 3 days, over 400 stories were submitted. Some were brief, others stretched for pages. A boy who had been handcuffed at 9 for throwing a rock. A girl who had watched her father tackled in front of her at a school pickup line. A teenager who had spent a night in Holden because a neighbor didn't believe he lived in the neighborhood. Chuck read them all, every single one. Macy read as many as she could. And then she asked to speak again. This time, not just in writing. It was the school principal who offered the stage. A small auditorium, no media, just the student body and teachers. A chance for Macy to speak to the kids who had been watching her from the edges since her return. Chuck sat in the back row as she stepped onto the stage. She wore a simple black shirt and jeans. No special outfit, no makeup. Her cast was the only thing that stood out. White and loud and decorated with 1,000 silent statements. She didn't use a microphone. She didn't need to. She spoke slowly, clearly, about what happened, about how it felt, about what it meant to see something wrong and do something anyway. She didn't cry, but some of the teachers did. She finished by reading the final line of her letter. I was scared, but I didn't lie. I was hurt, but I didn't hide. I'm little, but I'm not invisible. The room stood, not clapped, just stood. Later that night, Chuck and Macy returned home. They didn't talk much during dinner. The silence between them was comfortable, trusting. Afterward, Macy curled up on the couch and asked Chuck a question she'd been holding for days. Do you think Grayson's sorry? Chuck didn't answer right away. He leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable in the firelight. I don't know, he said finally. Some people say sorry because they mean it. Others say it because they're caught. And some never say it at all. Macy nodded. I don't need it, she said after a moment. Chuck looked at her. No, you don't. She returned to her sketchbook and began to draw again. This time it was a scale. On one side a badge, on the other a voice, and beneath it one line in thick, dark ink. When silence breaks, truth echoes. The courthouse in Red River didn't look like much from the outside. A single-story brick building with faded paint on the wooden columns and a flag that moved only when the wind demanded it. It was the kind of place people passed 100 times without thinking about what happened inside. But that day, it was the center of something much bigger than its square footage suggested. By the time the sun rose over the Texas horizon, people were already lining up outside. Some were locals, some had driven in from neighboring towns. A few had flown in from out of state. They weren't there for a protest. There were no bullhorns or chants. They came with notebooks, with hope, with quiet determination. They came to witness. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with low conversation and anticipation. The rows filled quickly. Journalists, legal observers, community leaders, and civilians who had somehow found their way into the middle of a story that refused to be forgotten. The wooden benches creaked beneath the weight of so many emotions. At the front of the room sat the judge, an older man with white eyebrows and a solemn gaze who had spent a lifetime threading the line between law and justice. His name was Judge Remy Caldwell, and though he rarely said much, everyone knew he was listening long before he spoke. The prosecution's table was neatly organized, each folder tabbed and labeled. The state attorney, a measured woman named Selena Park, had spent her career pursuing cases no one else wanted. She didn't smile much, she didn't grandstand, but when she spoke, people listened. Across the room, Sergeant Jeremiah Grayson sat at the defense table, his face stony and unreadable. He wore a gray suit that didn't quite fit his frame, and his hands rested stiffly on his lap. He hadn't spoken to the press. His lawyers had released the usual statement about complex circumstances and maintaining faith in the process. But his eyes told a different story. He looked like a man who had lost control of a machine he once believed belonged entirely to him. Behind him sat two representatives from the police union, silent and still. Their presence was meant to symbolize institutional solidarity. Instead, it felt like a wall, flat, unmoving, increasingly irrelevant. In the front row of the gallery, Chuck Norris sat with his hands folded. His posture was straight, his expression calm. He wore a dark blue shirt, no tie, no suit. Beside him, Macy sat with her cast resting on her lap. Her hair was pulled back into a braid. She wore the same t-shirt she'd worn the day she first spoke at school, the one with the words, "I stayed," written in small, careful letters near the hem. When the judge called the court to order, silence swept over the room like a sudden wind. The prosecution began by laying out the timeline. The incident at the park, the injury, the lack of medical response, the contradiction between Grayson's report and the eyewitness accounts. Then came the video, a short but damning clip taken from a city maintenance camera showing Grayson's aggression, his unprovoked approach, the moment Macy fell. The defense objected, claimed the footage was incomplete, context was missing, but the judge allowed it. Then came the audio. Selena Park played the recording from Macy's smartwatch. The room didn't move, didn't breathe. Macy's voice, small but clear, Grayson's words, sharp and commanding, the crack of the wrist, the scream, the silence that followed. A woman in the third row quietly began to cry. A man near the back clenched his jaw. Grayson stared at the table in front of him, his fingers tightening until the knuckles turned white. When the audio ended, the judge remained still for a long time. Then he nodded for the prosecution to continue. One by one, witnesses were called: the EMT who had responded, the nurse who had treated Macy, a forensic specialist who confirmed the force used was consistent with direct physical assault. Then came Chuck. He stood without flourish, took the oath, walked to the witness stand. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. He simply spoke about what Macy told him about the condition she was found in, about the steps he took afterward. He referenced his military experience only once, to explain how he recognized trauma when he saw it, even in a child's silence. The defense tried to rattle him, asked if he was prone to exaggeration, if he was using his fame to influence public opinion. Chuck stared at the lawyer and said only, "Fame didn't break her arm. Your client did." The courtroom remained quiet. The lawyer sat down. Then the prosecution called their final witness, Macy Norris. There was a long pause before she stood. The entire room turned toward her. She walked with measured steps to the stand, climbed onto the seat, and looked directly at the judge. She was sworn in. Selena Park approached slowly. "Macy," she said gently, "do you feel ready to speak?" Macy nodded. "Please, tell us what happened that day." Macy looked down at her lap, took a breath, then looked up again. "I was walking home from the library. I saw a police officer hurting a boy. He looked scared. I didn't know what to do, but I thought, if I recorded it, someone could help later." Her voice was steady, clear. "I didn't get close. I didn't say anything mean. I just watched. Then he came over and asked for my ID. I told him I was 11. He took my phone. He grabbed my arm. I told him my name. I told him my grandfather's name. He laughed, and then he broke it." She paused. "I screamed. He left. A lady helped me, that's all. The silence after her testimony was absolute. The defense declined to cross-examine. When Macy stepped down, she walked back to her seat beside Chuck. He reached out, and she took his hand. Closing arguments came quickly. The prosecution summarized the facts. The injury, the abuse of power, the silence that followed. They asked the court not just for a verdict, but for an acknowledgement that what happened mattered. The defense focused on doubt, claimed the situation escalated unexpectedly, that the officer felt threatened, that he reacted in fear. It was the same refrain that had been used in courtrooms for decades. But this time the courtroom didn't flinch. When the jury was dismissed to deliberate, no one moved. People sat where they were, quiet, heavy with the moment. It took 4 hours. When the jury returned, the air thickened. The foreman stood. For the charge of assault on a minor, we find the defendant guilty. For the charge of abuse of authority, we find the defendant guilty. For the charge of failure to render aid, we find the defendant guilty. Grayson closed his eyes. He didn't speak. He didn't react, but he didn't look at anyone, not even his own lawyers. Judge Caldwell thanked the jury. Then he addressed the room. This case is about one moment, but it reflects something much larger. Justice is not measured by how we treat the powerful, but by how we protect the powerless. Today, a child told the truth, and the court listened. He ordered sentencing to be scheduled within 30 days. When the gavel fell, the silence broke, not with cheers, but with the sound of chairs scraping against the floor, of people rising as one. Outside, the crowd had grown. Hundreds stood along the courthouse steps. As Chuck and Macy exited, the people moved aside, not with applause, but with nods, quiet murmurs, respectful distance. A reporter stepped forward. "Mr. Norris," she asked, "how does it feel to win?" Chuck looked down at Macy, then back at the reporter. "This isn't a win," he said. "This is a beginning." They walked down the steps together, side by side, unafraid. And somewhere beyond the cameras and the questions, justice took its first breath. The days after the verdict were unlike anything Red River had ever known. For a town that once measured change by the seasons and never by headlines, it now found itself spoken of in newspaper columns, on television panels, and across screens in cities whose names no one there had ever even visited. People didn't just talk about the verdict. They talked about the girl who testified, the grandfather who stood behind her, and the message that outlasted the noise. But for Macy Norris, life didn't change in the way most expected. She still woke up early, still tied her shoes with one hand, still sat by the same window in her grandfather's home and drew in her sketchbook as the sun stretched across the Texas horizon. The courthouse steps no longer buzzed with news vans. The banners and hand-painted signs that once waved outside the police department had been taken down. Their colors faded now, folded into closets and memory boxes. The world moved on, as it always did, but something lingered beneath the surface, a shift that wasn't loud but undeniable. At home, Chuck kept his routine. He brewed coffee at dawn, ran 3 miles before breakfast, and taught martial arts classes in the dojo 3 evenings a week. Yet, there was something more purposeful in his movements now, something even more deliberate than before. People didn't just come to train anymore. They came to listen. Teenagers who had never stepped on a mat stood in line outside, not to learn how to punch, but to ask what it meant to stand up. Veterans dropped in, silent and still, nodding once and joining in quietly. The dojo had become something more than a training hall. It had become a gathering place for those who were tired of being ignored. Macy sat through the sessions often, not as a student, but as a witness. She'd watch her grandfather teach not just form and technique, but discipline, restraint, and responsibility. Power doesn't mean you strike first, he told them. It means you protect first, and sometimes you don't strike at all, you just stand. His words weren't dramatic, and he never raised his voice, but every person in that room understood that he spoke from something deeper than experience. He spoke from conviction. One night, after a session had ended and the last of the students had gone home, Chuck found Macy sitting cross-legged in the center of the mat, staring at her cast. It had grown dirty over the weeks, covered in layers of drawings, messages, and faded ink. It was more art than medical equipment now, but it held weight. Not just physical, but symbolic. A badge of what had been endured and what had been built in its aftermath. "You ready?" he asked. She looked up. "To take it off?" He nodded. "I think so." They scheduled the appointment for the following morning. As the doctor gently removed the cast, revealing the fragile, pale skin beneath, Macy held her breath. Her wrist looked thinner than she remembered, weaker. But it didn't feel weak. It felt like it had healed with something more than calcium. "You'll need to rebuild strength," the doctor said kindly, "but the bones have set. You did good, kid." Macy smiled faintly and looked at Chuck. He offered her a nod, his version of a proud embrace. Later that day, they sat on the back porch of the house as the wind shifted through the dry grass. Macy rested her arm on the table. For the first time in weeks, it felt light, free. "Do you think people forgot already?" she asked. Chuck shook his head. "People don't forget truth. They might get distracted, but they remember what mattered." "I still think about him," she said quietly. "Grayson, about what he saw when he looked at me." Chuck looked toward the horizon. "He saw what he wanted to see, what he was taught to see. But that's not your burden. What matters is what you saw in yourself when it happened, and what you still see now." "I felt small," she admitted, "but not anymore. Now I feel, I don't know, steady. That's more than most adults can say." She smiled at that. The days passed and Project Lantern continued to grow. Thousands of new testimonies poured in, some from children, some from adults revisiting the pain they carried since they were children. The stories varied in place and detail, but all carried the same rhythm, a voice long silenced finally speaking. Chuck and Macy worked together to catalog them, to preserve them, to keep them from being swallowed by algorithms or spin. They built a network: lawyers, journalists, data scientists, artists, educators. Not an organization with suits and slogans, but a movement made of people who had simply had enough. The power wasn't in their numbers. It was in their willingness to show up. The state legislature took notice. Hearings were scheduled. Oversight measures discussed. The union bristled. There were counter-narratives, attacks, edited videos aimed at discrediting the movement. But every time they tried to twist the story, all it took was Macy's voice, clear, unpolished, and honest, to center the truth again. At one town hall event, an older man stood up and asked her, "Aren't you tired? You're just a kid." She didn't flinch. "I was tired of being quiet. Speaking isn't harder than silence. It just feels heavier at first." Chuck watched from the side of the room, arms crossed. He didn't need to say anything. She had already become the kind of fighter he never had to train. 3 months after the trial, a mural appeared on the side of an old building in Red River. Painted by local artists, it showed Macy's cast, fractured and blooming with light. Above it, a quote from her letter, "I was scared, but I didn't lie." Below, in bold, Red River Remembers. She and Chuck stood before it one evening at sunset, the orange light curling along the edges of the brick. "It's not really about me," she said. "I know," Chuck replied. "It's about everyone who finally spoke because you did." "Do you think it'll last?" "No," he said, "not by itself. Things never last unless we keep choosing them. But this gave people a reason to choose." She nodded. Then, without a word, she reached into her pocket and pulled out her old cast, now sawed in half and cleaned. She'd kept it like a relic, not out of pain, but out of purpose. They walked into the dojo together, placed it on a shelf near the entrance, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. By winter, the world had shifted again. The headlines moved on. New stories demanded attention. But Red River remained steady, no longer silent. Children were taught different lessons in school now, about courage, about ethics, about empathy, and in the quiet moments, on porches and at playgrounds, people still said her name, not as gossip, not as legend, but as memory. One night, as snow threatened to fall for the first time that season, Macy stood outside looking at the stars. Chuck joined her, pulling a blanket over her shoulders. "I was thinking," she said, "when I grow up, I want to do more than just talk. I want to build things, real things, that protect people." "You already are," he said. She turned to him. "How do you know when something's really over?" Chuck didn't answer at once. He looked at the sky, then back at her. "When you stop needing it to be." She looked down at her wrist, flexed it gently. No pain, no weakness, just the echo of what had once broken, now reformed. Then she smiled. "I think I'm ready," she said. "For what?" "For whatever comes next." Chuck nodded. "Then let's get to work." And as they walked back inside, the wind picked up, carrying with it not the sound of applause or headlines or praise, but something steadier. The sound of change, rooted in a child's voice, shaped by a cast, carried forward by steel. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe for more. Watch our other videos to discover powerful stories like this one. And don't forget to share it with someone who needs to hear it.